Oh, okay. Okay, well, buenos dias y gracias. That's my Spanish. Um, but thank you very much for inviting me. Let me just turn that down so I don't hear her. That's better. First of all, thank you for the big parade that you put on in my honor today. You really didn't have to, but I appreciate it. It's a very interesting educational and historical day, obviously, to be here, and I'm very pleased that this was coincidental. But first, again, I really thank the uh, the Ministry of Defense, the Armed Forces of Argentina, the University here of National Defense, and especially to thank Martin, who reached out to me. Uh, Academics don't get fan mail much, so it was very nice. And also people who study the defense industries are very few people, and we're a lonely lot. We speak our own language, and so it's very much a pleasure of mine to be able to come to you today and talk about the work that I have been doing. I have been studying defense industries and sort of the larger macroeconomic and macro political rationales behind armaments production. Uh, Lately, I've been looking a lot at how what I call small countries and their efforts to engage in armaments production. By small, I don't necessarily mean small populations. But these are countries that have generally very limited resources for engaging in armaments production. A lot of times they have had to pick and choose what areas they can get into, despite obvious ambitions on the part of many states to expand that. And particularly countries that just simply have limited technological or like I say, economic and industrial capabilities. And many of them, therefore, have engaged in what I call niche strategies, which I will go into. In the first case, I always like to start with this issue of how can states that have small or limited capacities for armaments production basically play the game of armaments? How can they create technologically competitive defense industries? How can they make those economically viable? And how can they make them self-sustaining? In other words, how can they pick and choose things to produce that will not only be needed by their national militaries, but also can be produced efficiently and effectively? Sustainability, therefore, means producing military equipment that quite often can be also sold globally. In other words, you need the exports in order to underwrite production for domestic consumption by your own armed forces. And therefore, I've looked a lot at what kind of strategies have countries around the world pursued, not always successfully, but that they've tried to do in order to be competitive in the global arms market. Can I have the next slide, please? It's probably hard to see this from most angles, but this is just something I did where I tried to place the global arms industry into a global perspective. It's very obvious that there are some countries that have and can and continue to do better in the field of armaments production than others. There is a global hierarchy. Now, at the top are the obvious players like the United States and Western Europe, which have sufficient resources and which have very advanced domestic technology bases, both military and civilian, that civilian industries that can feed into the military area. And we don't really look at those. At the bottom are countries that, for the most part, don't compete or don't produce a lot of different types of weapons. United Arab Emirates, Serbia, Mexico, for example. But it's that middle, what I call second tier states, which I find the most interesting, because these are countries that have differing degrees of capability and also differing degrees of success. And within that, you can even divide it further in the fact that you have small but very technologically advanced countries that have engaged successfully in niche production. Particularly, I'm thinking of Israel or Sweden or Norway. Then you have countries which are large, what I call aspiring great powers, particularly India and China, which want to produce their own arms, but historically have had very poor many problems due to a variety of factors that I will not really go into because it's, I think, irrelevant here. And then in the middle, there's countries which could be considered middle economy powers, countries that have stand in the middle technologically speaking. Argentina might actually fall into that category, but I'm not going to be the one to say that because I don't want to cause any problems. But anyways, there's other countries, South Korea, Taiwan. These are countries that we'll see when I get into some of my case studies here. So we have a global hierarchy. And then the point is then, we can go to the next slide, is quite simply, again, why build arms? I may be, as we say in English, preaching to the choir here, since I have a lot of people from the foreign minister, from the defense ministry and from the armed forces. It may seem obvious to many. It's the concern about the security of supply. That is, countries don't like to be dependent upon other countries for armaments, even when the armaments are cheaper, and even when you seem to feel that there are no real constraints on the supply of arms, but you can never be sure. Sanctions happen all the time. Look at Russia today. So if a lot of countries feel that if you're going to have sustainable military, then you need to have secure domestic sources of weapon systems. Secondly, historically, countries have used armaments production as a way to drive overall economic production. It's a lot easier to engage in things like coal and steel, or in shipbuilding, or in electronics, or even automotives, if there's a national security element behind it. It helps justify the reason for it. I'll give you an example in the United States. In the 1950s, President Eisenhower created something called the National Defense Highway System, basically a system of motorways, because he said it was imperative for national defense. Now, I doubt if 0.1% of the traffic on the interstate system is military, but that was the way they were able to sell it in the 1950s to a very conservative Congress. Finally, there's a whole field of what I call techno-nationalist drivers, in the fact that countries that aspire to being considered an advanced, modern, arrived country often want defense industries as an indicator of their status. This goes back to the 19th century with Japan after the Meiji Restoration. And the idea being that you couldn't be considered a modern nation if you couldn't produce your own armaments. And the slogan that the Japanese use, which other countries use, is rich nation, strong army, to which I would add strong army, strong defense industry. And so for a lot of countries, as we shall see, this idea of industrial development and technology goes hand in hand with advanced armaments production. Next. And then I'm going to be running through a couple of case studies to sort of show you what I mean. Brazil with light attack airplanes and transport aircraft. Bulgaria, an interesting case where it is a global supplier of small arms. South Korea, which has attempted to be on a miniature version, a lot like the United States in that it produces everything, and has had some successes and, well, many failures too. And then finally, Israel, perhaps the great exception, the great outlier in a way, as we shall see. So next, please. So Brazil, again, I'm sure most people here are pretty familiar with the experiences that Brazil had, particularly starting in the 1950s and 1960s, when it very actively engaged in defense industrialization, the concept of what they called security and development, with the idea being that armaments production not only supported national development, but also supported national defense and vice versa. The two were linked. And what we saw was a lot of successes in the Brazilian defense industry, particularly in the 70s and the 1980s. It was for a while the world's largest producer of wheeled armored vehicle, 4x4 or 6x6 armored vehicles. And these were sold pretty widely. It also developed something called the Tucano turboprop, which was a very effective trainer plane, which was even sold to countries in the north, particularly Britain bought them. And it engaged in a co-development program with the Italians called the AMX jet. And in fact, and it was also planning on producing its own missile systems, its own main battle tank, and even some type of shipbuilding. And in fact, in the 1980s, the future looked very bright for the Brazilian defense industry. It all sort of fell apart in part due to governmental chaos of moving from a military dictatorship to a rather freewheeling democracy through economic problems, et cetera. And a lot of that defense industry went away. And for the last 15 years, I'd say it's been slowly rebuilding. Certainly the ambitions to restore Brazil as a leading armaments producer, particularly here in South America, I think is still strong. That said, it's actually most successful in the area of building the Embraer air passenger jet. Very few people in the United States, when you get on a plane, you're on one of these jets, and they're very good and very effective, and they've made Brazil a lot of money. That being said, they are still trying to produce more advanced versions of the Tucano, which they've turned into a light attack plane. And they are even developing a transport plane, the KC-390, which will compete head-to-head with planes like the C-130. And in many cases, too, the government has said that it wants to resurrect production of its armored vehicles sector to build missiles, and it even has plans to build a nuclear-powered submarine. Next, please. And just to give you a couple of examples, because everybody likes photos. So there you can see the Super Tucano, which has even been sold to the US government, for example, as a counterinsurgency aircraft. And the KC-390, which I think even Lockheed might get involved in. So that's obviously a sign of approval. Moving on, next slide. Bulgaria. Bulgaria is a very interesting country in the fact that as an ex-communist Soviet bloc nation, its role in the old Warsaw Pact was mostly building small arms. Most of these were built, were Soviet weapons, particularly the venerable AK-47 or the RPG-7, which were built under license in Bulgaria. together with things like the ammunition to go with it. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, and particularly after 9/11, the United States came to rely very heavily upon Bulgaria to produce the kind of weapon systems that it then supplied to the Iraqi and Afghan governments that the United States were supporting. It was simply easier and cheaper rather than try and refit the Afghan army or the Iraqi army with US equipment like, say, M4 carbines or something, to just simply give them AK-47s and the ammunition that the Bulgarians then produced. And it was, in fact, an extremely prosperous and successful business venture for the Bulgarians. And by the late 2010s, 90% of what the Bulgarian defense industry was producing was exported. Now, the big question, of course, is now that the United States is out of places like Afghanistan, will the Bulgarians continue to be able to find us profitable? Because the US was essentially carrying that industry. Next slide, please. South Korea, the Republic of Korea, is a very interesting case study of an emerging arms exporter. It has been very ambitious in its efforts to become essentially an across-the-board arms producer. And they produce everything from their own small arms all the way up to, they're even developing a nuclear-powered submarine, not a ballistic missile carrying one, but a conventionally an attack submarine that is nuclear powered. They've had mixed results, which I won't go into because that would be a whole nother lecture. But they've had some successes. They produce a very good self-propelled howitzer, the K9, which has been able to find a very good niche in the global arms market. And in particular, they've sold it to a lot of Western countries, and particularly countries that are allies of the United States. They have also even produced their own main battle tank, which they have exported to Poland and Turkey. They are trying to develop their own jet trainers and light attack aircraft. This one, in case the T-50, which they've actually have successfully sold to a few countries. Can we go to the next slide now? Just finish this up. So you can see there the K9 howitzer. At the bottom is the T-50. The T-50 looks a lot like an F-16. As I've always said, it's like an F-16. If you left it in the dryer a little too long, it's kind of shrunk. But it's a very effective two-seater plane, which they are trying to adapt into a light fighter craft. And then up there on the right is the so-called KT-1, which is a primary trainer plane. And that is actually sold quite well too, despite the fact that the competition in that market is very stiff, particularly from the Swiss. Then finally, moving to Israel. Israel is an interesting case, obviously, because it started out in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, trying to be more or less a independent, self-sustained arms producer. They really did try to produce everything, in part because they suffered a number of sanctions and boycotts in the 60s and 70s. But by the 1990s, it became pretty apparent that such a defense industry was unaffordable. It simply could not be sustained, even with considerable financial assistance from the United States. And so there was an explicit policy change made in the 90s that essentially limited and condensed the kinds of weapon systems and the kinds of areas that Israel got involved in when it came to armaments production, and essentially created what you could call a core competency, to use a business school argument. Core competencies means that you're aiming at specific areas. In the case of Israel, there were two things. One, it was very much something that could be exported. And two, they were going to try and stay at the very high tech end of the business. And in fact, what we have found is that this has more or less succeeded. 75% of the industrial output of Israel's defense industries is exported. In other words, most of it goes overseas. And what that helps to do is support defense production or outfitting for the Israeli Defense Forces. And it also helps be able to underwrite all the very expensive research and development that the Israelis go to in order to maintain this niche at the high tech end of the market. And we've seen successes in specialization. They practically invented the modern drone, the modern unmanned aerial vehicles. They have continued to work upon that, going from a simple reconnaissance to ones that were armed and loitering, or what we now like to call an unmanned combat air vehicle. That is an armed drone that can release air-to-ground munitions. They've also made a lot of progress in various sensors, radar, but in particular, I like to draw out something called the Lightning, which is a targeting pod that is put under on combat aircraft that helps them be able to do very precise targeting at night and in bad weather. It competes directly with U.S. Equipment, and it's nevertheless sold very well. And then finally, in the area of a lot of different types of tactical missiles, air-to-air missiles, air-to-ground, anti-defense systems, anti-tank. In all of these areas, the Israelis produce very, very good products. They are very capable. They are very competitive, and they sell very well on the open market. And here, if we can just go to the next one. So you get a few examples here. This is in the upper left is one of the advanced drones. To the right is an air defense system that they have invented. On the left, at the bottom, is the Spike anti-tank weapon. And then lastly is this Lightning reconnaissance pod. So you see how that is. And so in a lot of these areas, Israel has done very well for itself. Next slide, please. Other examples, just briefly. Norway has done a very good job developing a new anti-ship cruise missile. I believe that the Argentines have bought it. Turkey has developed some very successful armed drones, which were used by Ukraine, particularly at the opening of the battle, to really cause a lot of damage to Russian forces. Spain is into small transport aircraft. Ukraine actually builds jet engines that go into a lot of aircraft around the world. And then finally, a country like UAE, the United Arab Emirates, is actually trying to create a defense industry out of nothing. And it's one of its first products are small armored cars. Okay, so just to sort of conclude, what are the kind of lessons that I think we can draw from this? The first, of course, and many of these may seem painfully obvious. The first is, if you want to be a successful arms producer, and particularly an arms exporter, you want to find a business area that you have a chance of competing in. You know, maybe don't build combat fighter jets, okay? That's really competitive. But you find a niche with relatively few competitors. This is how Israel was able to basically create a market and then dominate it for decades when it came to UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. And Brazil with things like the Tucano. which basically didn't really exist too much before they got into it, or has very few competitors. Or if you're facing a lot of competition, find a product or a market that is big, but actually very highly fragmented, and therefore what we like to say is highly commoditized. And what I mean by commoditization, or something being commodity, is where you have lots of products which are basically the same, and that you buy them not so much on their individual quality, but more and more you buy it when it comes to price. So commodities, like people know, like coffee. Most coffee is basically the same, and you buy depending on what you think you can afford, or copper or steel or things like that. And what you look for is a product that could be a commodity. This is what Bulgaria did, and I think very well. This is sort of what South Korea did with the K9 artillery system. There's a lot of countries, particularly in Europe, that produce self-propelled howitzers. But the Koreans produce a very good product and are able to sell it cheap or cheaper. And so they're able to come in and provide that system. Or what Norway has done with this thing called the naval strike missile, this new anti-ship missile, which they have been able to sell very widely to navies around the world. Secondly, the one thing that you really have to do, though, is if you get product, if you get a good market somewhere, do not ignore the fact that you're going to have to continue to invest in research and development to remain competitive. In other words, don't just coast, don't sit on your hands, as we say. Successful niche producers often have to put considerable profits back into their research and development to continue to upgrade their product. This is what Israel did with UAVs. They basically went from very small tactical types of UAVs and then developed ones that had a higher altitude or were of longer endurance. And then later armed drones, loitering drones, and the like. And so they were able to basically keep their market edge and keep their size of that market because they continued to improve their product. Norway did the same with the NSM anti-ship missile, taking earlier successes with a very small short-range missile called the Penguin, and then turning that into this new NSM. Another lesson is don't expect to make a lot of money at this. Armaments production is a very competitive business that offers very slim profits for the most part. And particularly when you're dealing with certain types of weapon systems like small arms, wheeled armored vehicles, light aircraft, they have relatively low price tags. And so they're going to generate relatively low revenues and relatively low profits. You're not going to make a lot of money at this. Neither are you going to employ a lot of people. A lot of these small arms companies maybe only employ a few hundred or a few thousand. So no one should go into armaments production thinking that it's going to rebuild your economy into some type of national security state that is going to be sort of self-sustaining in that regard. So one should always have a good deal of realism, not skepticism, but realism when they go into armaments production. Next page. One of the questions, and I hope this doesn't betray the fact that I am an American, but you should be really cautious about trying to compete head-to-head with large arms suppliers in the United States or in Western Europe. If they produce a product, they're often going to dominate that market. And in fact, they compete heavily with each other. If you want to buy a new fighter jet, for example, You put out a request for proposals, an RFP, and it's like throwing chum in the water. And all the sharks are going to come around, and all the potential suppliers will basically try to undercut each other. It's a buyer's market, and buyers use that to their advantage. So it's very hard for a small country to go in and try and produce something that they think will be competitive. But in fact, you're in a very crowded field. It's also important to know, and I'm sure many people do, is a lot of buyers have preferred suppliers. They have countries that they typically go to when they want to buy something. There's a reason, for example, I was in Singapore for many years. Singapore buys a lot of fighter jets. They only buy American. They will let the Europeans come in and offer them deals. There'll be a Rafale, there'll be a Eurofighter, but in the end, they buy an American plane. It's just a dance in a sense. And so you have to be very, aware of that. Successful niche suppliers have found places where the large countries don't compete. The United States doesn't build diesel submarines, for example. And so it is possible to break into that area. This is something that the South Koreans were able to do. And they produce submarines and they've sold them to the Indonesians. What they have done basically is steal German technology, but the Germans are so trying to sell next generation sub technology to the South Koreans that they don't complain. Then the other thing is, if you want to be a successful exporter, sometimes it's very important to find a partner. And Martin, I think, mentioned this. And so, for example, the USA essentially served as the agent for Bulgaria when it came to marketing their small arms. They offered them through foreign military sales, which is a very clever way of doing it. Foreign companies often buy up pieces of overseas companies. I mentioned here that, as you all know, that Lockheed Martin for a while owned a piece of FMA. And this was in part to try and market the IA-63 Pampa, particularly for the U.S., what we call JPATS, the Joint Primary Aircraft Training System. Another case is when British Aerospace took a 35% share in the Swedish aerospace company Saab, with the idea that British Aerospace was going to help market the Gripen around the world. If we turn to the next, and then finally, the last lesson is, and I know this is probably the hardest lesson, is, if possible, have a large domestic market already. You create a solid production base, which then helps exports, which means, of course, having a large defense budget and a large degree of armaments production, arms procurement, and in a lot of cases, some of the most successful exporters have been countries that have also been the best customers. So Korea is exporting the T-50, but it's also the largest buyer of the T-50. Brazil has the Super Tucano, but it has also bought something like 99 of them for the Brazilian Air Force. And in fact, the Israelis are often their own best customer for a lot of very important things that they need, particularly when it comes to missile defenses or anti-tank defenses and things like that. And then been able to spin that into very successful export markets. But again, that's really hard. Finally, the last slide. The challenges ahead. None of these lessons learned are guarantees of success, even if you do them. I know that's a rather depressing way to end, but just to let people know that it is hard to find a niche that you can successfully occupy and carve out a reliable, sustainable piece. Foreign partnerships, as everyone knows, are often very unsuccessful. Lockheed essentially just got out of Argentina. Because it just didn't create the fulfill expectations. Global arms market is dynamic with new competitors and in some cases very low brand loyalty. I know I said that a lot of countries have preferred suppliers, but it depends. There are areas where a newcomer can come in, particularly in areas that are themselves new. The drone business didn't even exist 25 years ago. And now, of course, it's got over 100 different suppliers of military drones around the world. And even in many cases, countries are using the kind of drones that you buy on Amazon for very tactical, often short-lived type of surveillance. But like I say, what that does is that encourages more competition, and that can be very difficult too. Sometimes when a field is, looks very, very prosperous, that unfortunately encourages more countries to get in, which makes it more difficult for you as someone trying to carve out a niche. And like I said, finally, one of the hardest things is creating a sizable domestic market to underwrite sustainable armaments production at home. That means, of course, you have to have defense budgets that are big enough and consistent. Defense spending has to be steady state instead of going up and down as it does in many countries. And then finally, I will say, when I look at Israel, I have to tell people that's a real exceptional situation. Israel is very lucky in the fact that the United States underwrites a lot of its technology. I'm sure if Argentina was given something like 3.3 billion US dollars every year to underwrite its military R&D, they would be very, very happy indeed here. So I guess that's where I would leave you. And I would be more than happy to take any questions that you might have. Again, just a few final thoughts. I've studied armaments production for a long time. It's very easy to get cynical about why countries produce arms. It's a tough argument to make because the risks are so high and the payoffs can be so low. And yet, all the arguments that I have made my entire career that countries should be getting out of the business usually fall on deaf ears. And so I'm more listening these days as to why countries continue to insist that it's important militarily and economically and technologically, and I can agree with those, but I'm also would just simply say, good luck. Thank you very much. That's good. Okay. Oh, and I didn't thank my wonderful translators who have to put up with me. And unfortunately, I think I slowed down. So,
Okay. Bueno, no sé si podemos abrir para preguntas o comentarios, aprovechando que tenemos aquí a Richard, bueno, cualquiera de los panelistas. General Barreto, sí, no sé si quieren.
Yo me puedo agradecer a Richard la claridad y precisión de la exposición que nos hizo. Mira, respecto a la situación en Sudamérica, ¿considera viable en función de la última diapositiva que presentó, la cual mencionaba que los socios extranjeros normalmente o frecuentemente no eran exitosos? Si considera que una integración regional en Sudamérica, en lo que refiere a la industria de defensa, puede ser exitosa.
Yes, very much so. First of all, I'm a little afraid. I talk with senior officers and I sort of feel like I should more listen than say anything. But let me turn that off then. No, and that's something that I think should be explored more and more by the countries in South America, particularly I think Brazil and Argentina and Chile, which have reasonably sized defense industries, and each country can bring its own strengths. That there is an opportunity there to do sort of what the Western Europeans have done. The West European defense industry is still highly national. There's a French defense industry, of English, British, and German, but more and more there is a multilateral regional defense industry. Most products, certainly most major products in Europe, are developed and produced by several countries all at once. The Eurofighter, this new sixth generation fighter, frigates, particularly missile systems. And I'm not saying that it has been the most successful or the most cost-effective way, but it's been one way in which the Europeans to sort of hold their end up, particularly when they're competing head-to-head with the Americans. So yes, I should think that there could be a lot of opportunities, particularly, bilaterally between Argentina and Brazil, which probably, Brazil, of course, the strongest and the largest defense industry in South America, although it still has its limitations. And by regionalizing projects and products, it can not only bring more money in, but it helps strengthen the political resolve behind these. Also, what it does is that oftentimes if two countries decide to co-develop a defense product, both countries commit to buying it. So you enlarge at least the initial product line. I think this is something that's probably long overdue. I don't minimize the challenges to doing this, but I certainly would encourage people to start to look down that road, because I think it could be very, very profitable, very, very sustainable. It's a good question.
Right. So, yeah. Coronel.
So, Richard, taking into account that small platforms are challenging large platforms to present for, do you have an opinion about if it is possible to renew military industry paradigm?
I'm sorry, I couldn't.
If there is a possible a new military industry paradigm.
Paradigm, new military industry paradigm. Yes.
Well, I think it's on one hand, there's a lot of historical continuity in the experience of armaments production. And a lot of that has been the fact that most countries, if they want to remain militarily competitive vis-a-vis potential adversaries, or just simply as an expression of being considered a regional great power, that never goes away. And that often is, if I get it, something related to hardware, related to product. Okay. But I think there is the possibility of a new paradigm. Maybe this is what you're alluding to, which is the idea that besides just platforms, aircraft, warships, submarines, there's the things that go into them. And particularly things like electronics, particularly new types of emerging technologies, We hear a lot, and I've actually been writing a lot on this, on what we call the fourth industrial revolution, which is based on things like artificial intelligence and quantum computing and large data mining and things like this. And there's a feeling that this is going to help militaries because, first of all, put aside this idea of robots that are going to fight our wars for. I don't think that autonomy, but this idea that artificial intelligence could help with things like battlefield and information to help you be able to see more clearly where you are. Yes, there's a lot of potential there, and therefore it does sort of open up a new type of defense industry, possible. And in fact, a lot of the work I've been doing lately has been looking at this concept, which is called military-civil fusion. It used to be called civil-military integration, but quite basically means the idea that you use highly advanced, high-tech commercial sectors, and then you sort of take that and put it into the military side. It's not a new idea, and it has been done going back decades, even centuries. For example, the first people to make cannon back in 500 years ago were actually the people who used to make bells for churches. Why? Because they knew how to cast large pieces of metal. Okay. And we see examples like that through history. And we also see examples where military developments have basically helped the civilian side, particularly when we look at passenger jets. Okay. All that jet technology came from the military side of things. But now we seem to be in this new phase, especially if we look at so-called fourth industrial revolution technologies. 99% of what's going on is in the commercial side, is in the civilian side. Everybody, people looking at AI are not in military R&D, okay? They're not in Lockheed. They're in some startup think tank in Silicon Valley. And then the questions are, how do you get those breakthroughs into the military side? How do you get the military to be receptive to those? Because I don't know about here, but in the United States, one of the biggest problems that the US military has is that if it doesn't come out of the defense research and development base, there's always a certain suspicion. It's what we call the not invented here syndrome. It's everywhere. Okay. And so this is something that has a lot of potential. It is a new paradigm, perhaps, but it has a long way to go. But thank you for bringing it up, because this is an area where countries which may not have traditional defense industries or may not have traditionally big defense industries, but if they have smart people at universities and at labs. This, for example, is what Israel is really big on. Israel is a commercial high-tech powerhouse, and they use all that. It means helping, prompting, funding, getting people to think about the military side of things. But thank you. It's an excellent question. Thank you.
No, para Martín.
No.
La mayoría, en general, lo que uno ve en empresas que originalmente han sido estatales, de la defensa que han sido estatales, han tornado a una constitución societaria mixta en la cual el Estado retiene mayoría de capital accionario, pero el hecho de tener capital privado hace que los riesgos de algún modo no sean asumidos el sostenimiento del proyecto exclusivamente por el Estado. Creo que es el caso de Singapore Technologies, orígenes, era una empresa estatal y hoy es una empresa de capital. ¿Hay algún tipo de previsión respecto a la posibilidad de que nuestras fábricas tornen hacia una diferente condición societaria?
Yo, o sea, digamos, creo que con respecto a nuestra realidad local, digamos, no vale la pena tanto especular en ese sentido. Lo que me parece es que sí es interesante ver ese tipo de casos eh, como modelos o digamos qué cosas se pueden replicar y qué condiciones tienen que darse para replicar cosas así. Pero digamos, lo que sí uno ve en los últimos 20 o 30 años es una tendencia en esta dirección, ¿no? Digamos, primero digamos, en algunos casos la privatización, pero en otros casos la, digamos, conformación en la forma de empresas, o sea, fábricas militares que pasaron a ser empresas, o sea, un poco la experiencia argentina es esa, en realidad eran fábricas militares, no eran, no funcionaban con la lógica necesariamente de una empresa, si bien fabricaciones militares era dueño o era accionista de empresas, en realidad las fábricas no eran empresas, y se vio una conformación de sociedades bajo control estatal, sea anónima o sociedad del Estado, ahí hay una multiplicidad de formas por la historia de cada una, pero sí como en la forma societaria. ¿Eso con qué objetivo se hace? Bueno, lógicamente se hace con un objetivo de buscar darle una dinámica de sustentabilidad independiente a la del Estado, de un funcionamiento más eficiente, digamos, de una, digamos, autonomización de los presupuestos de alguna manera, digamos, ¿no? Y algo muy importante que es la flexibilidad operativa, o sea, la flexibilidad para hacer cosas que el Estado tiene problemas o limitaciones para hacer, por ejemplo, en todo lo que es compras, y una empresa lo puede hacer con otra flexibilidad. Y esa tendencia uno, digamos, se ve en general, o sea, en China pasó algo así, también, digamos, eran fábricas militares y se convirtieron en empresas del Estado. Después en otros países, por ahí en países europeos, etcétera, se ve que empresas que por ahí eran también o con mayor participación estatal, digamos, incrementaron su participación privada, o se volvieron mixtas, o directamente se privatizaron del todo, o en algunos casos, y esto me parece interesante, salieron a cotizar en bolsa, lo cual es una forma también de introducir, digamos, incentivos, lógicas de mercado, restricciones, podríamos decir, que es, digamos, más difícil o es imposible hacer estando en la órbita estatal. Entonces creo que esas son herramientas que se pueden pensar y la otra es lo que mencioné un poco antes, ¿no? La cuestión que es algo, si se quiere, menos traumático en términos organizacionales, que es, digamos, la separación de estas funciones y la concentración, digamos, en particular de establecimiento de algunos mecanismos, digamos, de auditoría, de control, de gestión, etcétera, independientes, que reemplazan de alguna forma o sustituyen parcialmente el mecanismo típico que sería el mercado. Creo que una privatización del todo sería volver a lo que pasó en los 90, que es perder capacidades, ¿no? O sea, volvemos al problema de que, bueno, que es preferible. Yo, digamos, creo que hay que mantener capacidades, porque si no estamos continuamente desperdiciando inversión, ¿no? y recursos tecnológicos, etcétera. El tema es cómo hacer que eso funcione mejor.
Can I just add something there? Singapore technology is a good example because you're right. It's a public-private kind of thing. That is, there are private investors, but also the government maintains a very large share in that company. And in fact, when we look at a lot of defense companies in Europe that have been privatized, Giat, for example, or other kind, the government still maintains what we call a golden share. So it doesn't maybe get involved on a day-to-day basis, but it does reserve the right to get involved if they feel that there is something critical to national intelligence or national defense that's going on, in order to make sure that the company doesn't go under foreign ownership, or that it doesn't get involved in projects that they think might be contrary to national defense. But one of the advantages is you bring in new funding, and also what you hope is that with a mixed ownership, that you increase the commercial share of your work. So, for example, it's good for an aircraft company, even if you're building fighter jets, to maybe subcontract out to Airbus and build parts for them or something like that. It's a good source of revenue and income, so, and employment. So.
Bueno, no sé si hay algún otro comentario o pregunta adicional. Bueno.
If anybody wants to come up to me privately and talk to me, if you're shy. You know.
Bueno. Bueno, creo que ya se hizo bastante largo, así que vamos a ir terminando. Así que bueno, les agradezco a todos nuevamente por la presencia, a Richard por venir. Bueno, especialmente a toda la gente de las Fuerzas Armadas, del Ministerio de Defensa, está el subsecretario de Política Industrial también presente. Bueno, gracias a todos y seguimos. Ojalá que siga abierto el debate.
And please, if I can just once again thank everyone here. This has been a unique opportunity for me that I will always remember very fondly. I really appreciate the opportunity to come to a new country and a new city and meet new people and talk about old problems. Thank you. Gracias.